Hey, how's it going? I wanted to make a quick video about NestJS version 8, which is the newest major version that just came out a couple of weeks ago. So let's talk about some of the new things that has come up and what are the different changes. So first things first, a new feature that just got added to NestJS 8 is API versioning. This is something that you can probably pull off before using your own configuration, just setting up probably custom routes for a different version. Well, now it's a built-in feature where you can take an existing controller and you can provide a version, or you can also assign versions to individual controller methods. So if you're not familiar, versioning is usually used for cases where, let's say you created an API and you released it to your customers, and then one day you decide or your requirements change and now you have to create a completely different result for your API. In their example here, they have a find all, get cats. What if, let's say one day your requirements changed and you went from returning home cats to wild cats? I don't know. So that's a scenario where you might return an API that supports both versions, where you're returning the old response and also supporting the new response, so that you can kind of give your users some time to transition over. So it allows you the ability to support both versions. So that's kind of versioning in a nutshell. I think this topic in general, would be good as a standalone video that I'll cover in the future. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in that. All right, next up is a dedicated serverless documentation in the NestJS documentation. So if you go to the NestJS website or documentation, you'll see under the FAQ section, there is now a dedicated serverless document here that kind of talks about the various approaches you might take to use NestJS in a serverless environment, which is actually an interesting thought if you haven't considered it. NestJS doesn't have to run on a server. You can run it on a Lambda, for example, in AWS. Typically, how you would approach this is, if you were doing things in AWS native, you might have an AWS gateway, and then behind that is an AWS Lambda, and usually you'd use the gateway to do your routing and stuff, right? But what you can do is you can use the gateway to just route every request to a single Lambda, and that single Lambda can run whatever routing framework that you want to use. So for example, maybe you want to use Express, maybe you want to use NestJS in this example. So then every request just goes to that Lambda, and then the framework that you use sort of handles the rest of the routing logic. But even though that is possible, there is a slight cost, because there is, as they talk about here, there's a cold start for the amount of time that it takes to actually sort of spin up that Lambda along with your framework. So those are the things that you want to consider. They do have some benchmarks in here, and they talk about how to improve that with Webpack and stuff. So definitely check that out. Again, this I think is another good potential standalone video that I can cover in the future. Let me know if you're interested in that. All right, next in the list is lazy loading modules, which is actually a really nice addition, because if you watched some of my Adonis content, a big feature that Adonis has is the ability to lazy load controllers. So it's able to spin up the server while you're developing much quicker than something like NestJS, which does have a little bit of a spin up time. So this addition of lazy loading modules means that you can kind of on demand load in your controllers, which is going to speed up your startup times. So this is a really nice addition, and I think this is also going to be useful potentially in the serverless scenario that I talked about. So again, like they say here, in a serverless environment where cold starts are crucial, it's important to be able to kind of on demand load only what you need when you need it, and that's going to improve performance in general. So this should have benefits not only in, I believe, startup times when you're developing locally, but also in a serverless environment. So those are really the big changes. There's a couple other small things in here that I can go over real quick. So for example, if you've ever used the ConfigService, which I highly recommend, think of it as sort of like using .env in Express or other Node.js apps. It's just a dedicated service for pulling out environment variables from an env file or something similar. They just have some improvements here with TypeScript v 4.2. They have now the ability to kind of infer the nested values of things. So for example, in this case, they have an example, database.host can now infer that the value of that host is a string, even though it's sort of a a nested property. And previously, I guess it just wasn't able to do this, and it would have typed that value as any, and you would usually have like the two brackets to specify that that's a string. So that's a nice little addition there. Another improvement that has come in is the support for multiple event subscribers. This is specifically for the microservices pattern in NestJS if you're using that, and specifically the event-based pattern if you're sort of doing things where you want to publish events and kind of react to those events. Usually this is what you would use. They're just saying here that now we're able to register multiple event subscribers within a single microservice. And how that's going to work is they'll be able to execute asynchronously in reaction to the incoming event. Another minor, although very nice change that they added is some improvements in the logging space. So with NestJS, if you didn't know, you can use a custom logger. But the problem with that is the logger isn't able to sort of kick in and start working until Nest actually initializes it. So if there's any logs that come out before that initialization, it ends up being printed using either the built-in logger or whatever else is being used by default. So now they're saying here is you can enable buffer logs true, and it's actually going to wait for your custom logger to be fully loaded in before it starts printing out the logs. So that just kind of helps, you know, make your logs consistent from start to when you actually start seeing the logs in your console. And then finally, to wrap up, they talk about some updated dependencies. So now there's support for socket.io for 4.0. If that's something you've been waiting for, now there's support for it. And then another one is that NestJS v8 is also using RxJS v7 as a dependency. So again, if that was something you maybe were waiting for or were reliant on, now there's support for it. So I think that pretty much wraps up the main changes to NestJS v8. If you want to read this blog post, I'll post a link to this in the description. This is in the Trillin site, which is, I believe, the main supporter of NestJS. You'll also want to check out the actual version 8 release in GitHub for Nest, which adds in a little bit more of the details that they didn't really cover in the blog post. So for example, a big thing that you might want to know about is there's a deprecated HTTP module which used to allow you to naturally integrate with Axios in an NestJS application, but they're saying they don't want to have that hard dependency anymore. So instead of it being built into their framework, it's sort of a standalone package now. If that's something you're using, you just have to install NestJS Axios. So you just have to install that extra package. But other than that, I think the rest of the setup, if you were using it before, should work mostly exactly the same as previously. And then there's a bunch of more other core details in here that you might want to read about. I don't really think it's worth going over, but I'll also leave a link to this in the description. Anyways, guys, that wraps up this video. Just wanted to do a quick update since I know most of my subscribers are probably here for the NestJS content, so I figured it might be good to just cover real quick. If any of those core topics are very interesting to you, let me know in the comments and I'll definitely consider making a dedicated video for those. Anyways, thanks for watching and have a great day.